Hi, I'm Yolanda and this is Speak On. This week it's Men's Health Week, so we thought we'd pull together a special episode that contains some content from our previous event series, We Need to Talk About Mental Health. The full series is on YouTube if you'd like to go and catch up, and at the same time that we ran that, we actually did a few special episodes on our podcast focused on men's mental health. The talks we picked for this episode are The Pressure to be Buff, featuring Dr. Russell Delderfield and Laurence Fountain, and Are You Man Enough? The Crisis of Masculinity, which was hosted by Danny Price and featured Alexis Court, Ash Bhardwaj and Nathaniel Pamah. First up is Dr. Russell and Laurence from the panel The Pressure to be Buff. Today we're talking about the pressure to be buff, body image, eating disorders, exercise disorders, and men, which is something we don't really talk about that much. It's something I don't know that much about because I've never heard anyone talk about it. I just hear it so focused on women. So I've got two brilliant people joining me on the panel today. I've got Dr. Russell Delderfield and I have Laurence Fountain as well. So guys, I'll ask you to introduce yourselves and say a little bit about yourself. If I start with Russell and then go to Laurence.
Hi there. So as Yolanda said, I'm Dr. Russell Delderfield. I'm a psychologist and I study male eating disorders and everything associated with that qualitatively using very specific methods. I work at the University of Bradford in the north of the UK. And I've been doing this now for about 10 years, I think, and have various publications and things if you decide you want to look anything up. But other than that, that's enough about me for now.
And Laurence?
Where do we start? I'm your former trainer. I'm a body transformation coach. I have a gym in East London. I have a deep passion for transformation on a much deeper level, and over the last 10 years of experience, we've really started to nail down and focus on how can we deliver everything rather than just simply the aesthetics. And a huge part of that comes mental stability, or the idea of can we have the tools to handle life well and respond and react appropriately to whatever life has to throw at us. And that's really where my heart's been for a good amount of time now.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, so Laurence used to be my trainer, and the reason I invited him on today is when I was training with him, it was at that time when basically lots of people in my life had passed away and I was in not the most amazing mental space, and he was the first personal trainer that actually said, how are you sleeping? What about your sleep? What about what you're eating? What about your emotional health? What about your mental health? And it kind of presented me with way more balance than I'd ever had with any trainer or anything before. And I realized that it wasn't just about like losing weight or anything like that. It was about how I can find that balance and be healthy and happy within myself. So I just thought he'd be like a perfect person. And Dr. Russell, I mean, you are basically the expert on this. So we're going to just pick your brain and find out everything that we can. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go to Russell first. Is it common for men to have eating disorders?
Well, it's commoner than we think.
Mm-hmm.
The data that we collect, particularly in the UK, isn't really very coordinated. So we don't have a true picture, if we're honest. And I think scientists should be honest about this. The fact is about 9% of recorded cases of presenting and then being treated for an eating disorder are male. So we know that, and often the figure 10% appears in the press a bit rounded up. So I'm fine with that. That's reasonable. So that means if we have about, it's really rough, but about 730,000 cases, then we're talking, a small portion of the population in terms of numbers that are men have eating disorders, but we're still talking about tens of thousands. So that's an awful lot of men and all of their loved ones, all of their families, all of their social circles and their employers that are all in some way often affected by what the man's going through. That's still a lot of lives, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there like has there been an increase at all in recent years?
Yes and no. So again, I'm going to be brutally honest here. Often when you see newspaper stories, it tends to be that little bit of an edge of creating that buzz and interest to make sure people read the story. So it is often reported we've had an increase, and it's even sometimes reported by charities. But there's no evidence of that in terms of how many men are experiencing it. What we've had a massive increase in is men coming forward to get help, support, and treatment. But we've not seen any. So that we often do kind of studies that are called population studies, where we look at people who may have indicators of these types of symptoms, these behaviours, beliefs, practices. But it doesn't mean that they're diagnosed with an eating disorder and currently getting treatment or support. They tell us that the incidence, the occurrence of eating disorders in men is still quite stable, but lots more people have been accessing treatment.
Yeah, okay, that's good to know that people are starting to come forward. And why do you think more men are starting to come forward about this?
I think I have two primary reasons. I think there's a lot more, but the two main ones are media does help. So the more we raise awareness of this stuff, the more an individual man might think, okay, so I'm not completely on my own then, or I'm not completely insane, mad, bonkers, not functioning well, all those derogatory words we use to ourselves about ourselves. And so then that sometimes stimulates someone to go, I think I should maybe talk to someone about this. This is what I'm doing. I'm doing these behaviours. I'm in these obsessions. I'm stuck in this cycle and I can't break it. And it's damaging my emotional health and my social life. And the other one is, I think, so this is a bold thing I'm saying here, but I feel okay saying it because of the stuff I research. Because I do qualitative psychology, I think masculinity as a construct that women experience of men and men experience individually and together is changing, not quick enough or deep enough, some might say, but it is more likely that we've got more men who don't think it's as big a statement to make about what kind of man they are if they just go and get some help. It's not a weakness or a shortcoming, or it's not even admitting to some terrible personal failing. I think some of those attitudes are gradually being chipped away at, and that's why we see more men thinking, oh no, I can get help. This is actually okay. I can talk to someone about it.
Yeah, thank you. And over to Laurence. So alongside talking about eating disorders today, we're also talking about kind of, I suppose, compulsive exercise disorder, or kind of, I suppose, excessive working out. Is this something that you've seen? And if it's something that you see, what do you do about it as a trainer?
This is actually my biggest concern with the modern world right now, is that they are lacking context when it comes to exercise. We live in this society where more is better. If you're not dying, or if you're not got the blood, sweat and tears on the floor, then you haven't earned the ability to, call yourself, a fitness fanatic or a fitness addict. And we use all these slurs like that, if we were to put them into connection with other words, that it would be grotesque. To call someone an addict wouldn't be a healthy way to speak to someone. But we've grown this culture where everything's intense all the time, and people have lost the idea that we are still human, even though we are as a whole a little bit healthier and a bit more aware of fitness as a prerogative to a better way and a healthy way of life. When you have no context to understand that the impact of that exercise is another key stimulus alongside work, alongside the stress of a bad relationship, alongside junk food, alongside poor sleep, and you put all that into this big melting pot of stress and stimulus, and people wonder why we live in a society just punished by anxiety, depression. And I think it's a consequence of only ever portraying how much hard work you're doing for a lot of people, and not portraying the fact that, you know, these are so I can go to bed at 7 o'clock. This time of night is my bedtime. But that's not the sexy bit. That's not the cool bit. That's not what's going to get me likes on Instagram. They want to see the big lifts, the training hard. And I just think there's this pattern now of, you know, even health professionals, fitness professionals, they're the worst. Like if you speak to them, they've all got chronic anxiety, depression, body issues, confidence issues, and it all comes from this overstimulus and having that poor psychology from poor quality sleep that sort of creates a slightly more negative subconscious. We know it's inherently negative anyway, but then you really, if you're going to bed hyped and pumped up all up with adrenaline flowing through the body, and that's how your body's having to rest throughout the night, you know, being heavily stimulated by the release of continuous glucose into the brain, then of course you're on this constant sympathetic train where the body just has no opportunity to sort of come back to its natural homeostatic set point where we can really utilize food properly. And so people are just missing the whole point. Is like this no days off, go hard or go home. It actually stops you from absorbing the food that you need to be healthy and happy and to sleep well and to feel good and to have this beautiful self-perception of yourself where you can be confident in your own body, because all that changes when, you know, nutrient deficiency is in play, because you're addicted to the you know, the stimulus and the cortisol release and of exercise. And, you know, you can probably hear from how passionate I am about this, that this is a real concern. We're no longer living in a generation of lazy people, but people who are heavily addicted to stress and stimulus and that can't switch off, that would rather not switch off and keep connected in some way to some sort of to some sort of stimulus, whether that's social media, exercise, hard dieting. It's all very it all seems to become very addictive.
Yeah, and you made so many good points in there, because if you think about one of the things I was going to ask as well is like where do you think this is coming from in terms of, like, I suppose men's increased interest in exercising a really specific way and kind of having a really specific body or physique or whatever else. Where do you think that comes from? I know you touched on social media there, and I think the main point that really kind of stood out for me is that there seems to be this kind of focus towards hard work, and constantly, if you're not working, you're not doing anything at all kind of mentality, which we see across fitness, which we see across kind of work, across loads of different things. Like, I follow people that own businesses and they're like, team no sleep. And it's like, why wouldn't you want to go to sleep? So where do you think that kind of drive comes from for men to have that kind of body that they're seeking?
I think those without it seem to think that their happiness may increase should they get to a certain point with their physique. And I can tell you from experience, it absolutely does not. So there's that constant drive to, you know, it's part of society, part of our rat race. There's that constant drive to get ahead, because if you're ahead, you're happier. But unfortunately, that's not true, and we've become detached from the opportunity to just be present with oneself, rather than always constantly thinking about how we need to progress and how we need to move forward with our careers and our physiques. And where does it come from? Maybe beautiful lighting on Instagram, you know, the fact that anyone, you know, steroid use, the fact that you know, I think, like, you know, personally from experience, I've done the photo shoots, the fitness photo shoots, and I don't look like that. I don't look like that in real life. It's just the way it is. And but you can be easily led to believe that that standard is normal. So that you can almost feel like, oh, I'm not enough.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not enough the way they are. But the truth is that person probably only looked like that for a day, worked for almost 20 to 30 weeks, eating very little, and got that way. But because of what we betray on social media, because we do it with smiles and we only show the good and we never show the anxiety and the fact that you slept for 2 hours a night and woke up 4 times in that period, that that they think that that's it's a nice place, a beautiful process. So standards have changed.
And Russell, what do you think there? Because I saw you nodding emphatically.
Oh gosh, try and stop me. I will try and rein myself in. So Laurence is absolutely right. Standards have changed. There's a big, our bodies are not, we want people, we are desperate for people, certainly in the West, to believe that the individual is everything. You're in control of your destiny. This is all down to you. I mean, things like the American dream are built on that, the way that our constitution is unwritten, the way we commodify the flesh and blood that is the human body. And if you put that in, if you lump that in with everything else, the issues that have got us here with men are the same as an eating disorder, which is they're all multifactorial. There's more than one thing in play. Mm-hmm. But the thing that strikes me the most is the more that we present this idea that our bodies are not functional, and certainly settling for them being functional is not good enough, and that we should be doing something with them, and if we're not worthy. Mm-hmm. And if we don't live long, we're not worthy, and blaming people around lifestyle choices, making something like obesity into a lifestyle choice, mm-hmm. as if it were like a decision to pick up smoking, when most people know that what leads people to obesity, it cannot sometimes and often involve some personal choice, but it doesn't boil down to that at all. So what I want to throw in the mix is this whole thing around well, 2 things really. The Adonis complex that was kind of investigated about 20 years ago now, and has kind of stayed, which charted this change in the way that men were expressing themselves, and discovering that they were valued for an aesthetic as much as women formerly had been for centuries. Mm-hmm. Now, it's a bit of a myth to say that men were never valued for an aesthetic. They were always valued for their money, power, ardent displays of masculinity, ability to provide, ability to protect, all that kind of historic masculinity stuff. Mm-hmm. There have been periods in history where men's aesthetic, where their look, their ability to display themselves like peacocks, and the perfect peacocks, have been really entrenched in a culture. And we're cycling back round to this to some degree. So the kind of tyranny that's governed women's bodies for years, that so many thousands, if not millions of women have worked to break free from. I am more than what you perceive when you look at me. I am more than an object of sexual desire, or an example of fertility. Mm-hmm. Some of that tyranny is being visited upon men, and we're all kind of colluding with it. Mm. We're all investing in it. The people are lapping it up. Love Island that's new. That isn't something outdated from the 1960s, where people were put practically naked on display for our titillation and amusement, and for us to pass comments on which one you fancy the most, or who's doing what to whom. So there's this Adonis complex idea is very interesting, and as Laurence has said, a lot of men have translated this into very specific ways of doing exercise, or focusing on, to the fact where you can do body workouts that focus on different body parts, or today's leg day, today's chest day. It's like fetishizing bits of a man's body, fetishizing your own body. Now, I'm not saying, I'm not a trainer. There's probably very legitimate reasons for a man building that in and breaking that down to hit his goals. But when really we're talking about how a body looks, because the man isn't going to set foot out the gym and try lifting a truck off a poor old pensioner laid in the middle of the road who's been run over. You know, if they don't need the strength for functionality, if something else is driving that, if in the background there's a cocktail of all sorts of self-worth and self-esteem things going on, then it is kind of human nature to drive those terrors and those fears into something. And currently it's ploughing into a lot of men's bodies. So there's one more thing I'll say about it, and I promise I'll hand over. So there's a really good example of this, which is, I mean, I collect this stuff, my data analysis, but oh goodness, it drives me nuts. The dad bod.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, putting someone like Chris Hemsworth under a long lens camera, playing on a beach, normally a private beach, with his family, in between Marvel Universe films, and then the whole article is about how he's let himself go, and that's exactly what Laurence is saying. No, that's relaxed muscle under just a normal human amount of subcutaneous tissue, because he isn't on a regime where he works and works and works, bulks, cuts or shreds, and then dehydrates himself for 3 days because he's about to do a near naked scene on a screen. And the fact that we've now got to a man's functional, healthy, the man goes surfing, he does all sorts of activities with his kids, that is a healthy, functional man's body, and now we're calling that a dad bod and shaming him for it. And he's just what I plucked that name out of the air. I've got so many of them. Yeah. And it's just, it really, I mean, how are regular men meant to live up to that? You know? Because isn't it? Yeah, we're tricking men just like we tricked women for years that the only desirable body was this one. And if there's even a tiny ounce of fat, if it looks like there could be a ripple over a waistband, then you're not worthy. And now we're doing it to men. And we know for a fact that these people in the public eye work under very expert professional help to get to the place where they are ready to be on camera. But we're passing it off as if it's normal.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like, you've made so many good points there, because it's genuinely the scrutiny that women have been under for such a long time. So when I saw that, I was like, well, this just seems, this is like the same song, just slightly different melody. Yeah, that's literally what it is. And I wonder, like, Laurence, have you seen like people kind of not react to that necessarily, but do you think that's got that's a huge contributing factor? And do you see a lot of guys' self-worth like attached to how they look, and kind of see any like psychological effects from that? And is that something you have to kind of counter with your more positive kind of training regime?
I think it's a sort of, my opinion is slightly different in the sense that a lot of guys that I work with find more self-worth in the rest of their lives when they utilize a certain lifestyle to get into better shape. Obviously, it can be abused, and it can become a point of just an unnecessary feeding of ego. But at the same time, you talked about previously, like lifting weights that you never need to. It's the sort of the stimulus and emotional drive that you get that from doing those exercises, and the stability that you get mentally by conquering something on a day-to-day basis, I think actually fundamentally, if done right, can be supporting the self-image and mental stability of men around the globe. And so it's where the line is drawn, I'm not so sure, because I think there is a small amount of pressure to be healthier, happier, eat better, sleep more, and the aesthetics be a byproduct of those things, is essentially something that every man should really think about investing time, money, and effort into themselves. But in terms of feeling the pressure to look a certain way, is it a double-edged sword? Potentially, yes. Could it work in both directions? Potentially, yes. So could that little bit of pressure to look a certain way actually make this guy feel quietly a lot more calm and confident and more masculine in his presence, yeah, maybe. I think it's something that needs to be considered case by case, and something that needs to be thought about more the intention behind the actions, rather than the I'm not good enough, I need to change, rather than I'm worth every bit of time and effort to put into being a better person. And sometimes the muscular physique comes as a side effect and a byproduct of care and attention and love to yourself. So it's a real complex subject of, you know, where that line gets drawn, and how much pressure to be healthy is healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting because it on kind of the within, I suppose, where women are with body image, we still have a long way to go, because things like bloody Daily Mail and their sidebar of nonsense still exists, where every woman is putting on, if you're standing there, you're putting on a busty display purely because you're a woman standing there with tits. But then, you know, or, you know, how dare she wear that? Or like everything is about being on display. None of it is just about existing or being in a film or living your life. And they're starting to do that to men more and more. But where I think where some of the female body positive movement is going is where we're talking about body neutrality, being happy that your body functions the way it does. And like you were saying, like both of you said, really looking after it in a way that makes you happy, that is about you being healthy, having balance. And if it changes as a result of that, it changes as a result of that kind of thing. But it's about just being happy with just being like kind of praising your body and loving yourself in a really specific way, regardless of maybe how that looks. So yes, I think that's maybe, I don't know, I hope that we can shift that over to both, like to all genders as well. So how can people start approaching, so if anyone has recognized any of these things in themselves or in others, we'll start with actually in them, with people recognizing it in themselves. How can people start approaching exercise and eating in a healthy way if they feel like something is disordered? I'll go to Russell first.
Well, even if it's not disordered, if you think things have moved to a different place for you, but
yeah,
and it often, not always, you can't promise that in psychology, but often you can tell that something shifted and maybe is less healthy or less useful or less self-nurturing than it was before. One of the things that I tell people is about whether or not what you're saying or doing to yourself with your own body, your own diet, your own regime, whether that's something you would put on someone else. Let's say your young son or your best mate who's going through a bad time, or, you know, someone you actually care about and think a lot of. Is that something you would be making them do now in the pursuit of, let's say, a change of lifestyle or a fitness goal? I mean, one of the things that I find quite inspiring about what Laurence is saying is that idea that if all of our health and fitness industry strove to be holistic, well, it's never just about physiological fitness and function. It's absolutely about your whole experience of living your life and your well-being and where you want to get to. Because one, not everyone who goes to a gym and works hard at that has a disorder. That's really important. That's certainly not true of every man. But two, the other thing is that you can also still have goals, health goals, but they may not be bodily focused in the sense of material fitness. And I think if you're having conversations with yourself that are becoming punitive or moving, you know, Laurence was talking about that stress, that anxiety. If you find those little self messages are kind of shifting from being about being better at work, being a better dad, being a better person at home, being a better person for your mates, whatever that might be for you, and it's now turning on to what you're putting in your body, when you're putting it in your body, whether you can adjust that. And if it all starts getting a bit negative speak, and it's about you failing and you know, aren't you crap, you haven't done this, and you said you would do this today, and you promised you were going to do this and cut that and go to this. Once it begins to turn negative, you really need to start thinking about, well, if that was someone else and whom I loved and esteemed, is that the way I'd treat them and talk to them? Because if not, then I really need to have a think about the way I'm treating myself.
Absolutely. And Laurence?
The question was, how would you identify?
Oh, so how can you like start approaching that if you've identified that something is maybe happening or disordered or stressed or kind of just a little bit wrong? How can you approach exercise and like fitness and eating in a healthier way?
For me, the way I would always start with someone is by changing the root habits. So nothing that's too pressured, something that results in a greater yield of happiness as a result of something simple that remains unthought about, something that doesn't necessarily can be tracked but not necessarily scrupulously measured. So their hydration and the fact they're getting enough vegetables and the protein sources and the fact that 90% of the diet's whole foods. I think like we have this intuition that we know what to eat, what the right foods are to eat. And obviously that intuition is overridden by the influence of stress. And we should really identify, okay, what's the reason why I chose this food? Do I choose this food because I want it, or was it about short-term gratification? Was there any sort of long-term happiness that I was going to gain, or nutritional content that I was going to gain from that will really help me handle life a little bit better? Mm-hmm. So I think it's being conscious of why you're eating certain things, whether that is causing damage to your mental health, your physical health, and asking yourself, do you need help? Because that's something that's in abundance in this day and age, is the fact that if it doesn't feel quite right, there are a lot of resources to say, maybe we could try this. And it's really okay to experiment with different ways of eating. There are a million different ways to be healthy. But I think intuitively, we know when things are slightly going wrong. We know as humans, we choose good food when we feel happy. Mm. And, very rarely will someone cook like a burger and chips at home. I just don't see that anyone who prepares their own food tends to go into this a healthier option. And I think moving towards a more ritual style of eating where, like we talked about before, there is time away from the world with loved ones. And that would be a key indicator that you're not getting things right. If there's not that celebration of food and celebration of eating, if there's not time spent with loved ones and bonding over food, then you can be sure that you've probably lost your way. And that would be the first steps for me, is designated time for you to enjoy food. And there's really basic principles of where to start. The details are less important. When we talk about calorie control and macronutrient control, the way the body processes food and utilizes its nutrients is how calm we are when we sit, when we slow down, we shift into that parasympathetic state. Digestion starts to flow, or the stomach acid starts to get released, and we can just utilize it properly. But that takes being conscious of the fact that we do need to be grateful for the fact that we're even having this opportunity to sit down and eat and just slow the fuck down.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we were putting this together, we actually had quite a few questions, and which is kind of what I've been going through here. But one of the main questions we had, because there are a few people that are booked in to watch this back, is what can people do if they spot this in their loved ones? So we've had some people that may have spotted it in their children, in their partners, in their friends. What should people do if they're like, okay, I think that there's something is off here? I'll go to Russell first. How can people approach this without, I suppose, frightening people or pushing people away?
Yeah. There's a really, well, I hope it's good. it's mine. There's a chapter in a colleague's book, Lynn Crilley's book, called Hope with Eating Disorders, and it's a chapter just about men and boys, and there's some advice in there of kind of approaches to take. I mean, literally things to maybe say, or things to avoid saying, or where you can get safe information from that's accurate. The main thing is really to let the man know that you are up for talking about something if he wants to, without necessarily putting a name on it, because as we've been saying in this, it may be the man might want to talk to you about some of the other things going on in his life, even if what you've done is spotted some behaviours around his body, his exercise, his diet. Be open to that. I feel as if you just let the bloke know that they can say something to you about anything that's on their mind, they're more likely to then continue by saying, and I'm a bit worried this has got a bit out of control, or I feel like I knew what I was doing with this diet package I'm on, that I've subscribed to, that I meet up with once a week, and now I feel like I'm losing my way with it. They're more likely to get to that place if you let them know that you've spotted, you think something might be amiss, that things are not quite okay with them, and then take it from there. I think this is from experience and from kind of empirical research. I think you have to have a certain sort of relationship with a man or a young man to be able to kind of say to them, I'm really worried that you've developed some problems around food or around your fitness and your body stuff. There's got to be a certain strength of a relationship there before you would automatically be that direct. But I'm saying it because I'm not ruling it out. You could, if you have enough of a relationship and things do feel that obvious. Sometimes, I'm being really careful how I say this, sometimes these things can leak a little bit around the edges to the point where all genders can use the same strategies to kind of see if someone will notice. They're not always conscious. You're not consciously saying, I'll just skip this meal and make a big deal about it, or I'll skip this meal and be absolutely steadfast in my refusal to eat properly, or that's a slightly glib example, but sometimes we do leak things, and that might be because a bit of our brain's saying to us, somebody noticed that I'm not doing so well, because I don't know how to just say it out loud. So that I'll stop there, but that's what I would say.
Brilliant. And Laurence, if somebody spots it, and I suppose, I don't know, have you ever spotted it in a client where you're like, I think that, or someone that you may know that you think was maybe over exercising or compulsively exercising? What did you say, or what would you suggest someone should say if they've seen that?
Well, it may be slightly different from what I would say to how they would approach it. I would approach it by breaking down the sort of biochemical processes to make them understand that actually this isn't a healthy process in which they're involved in, and maybe some of the symptoms and feelings and thoughts that they're having right now are connected to these issues, and explain how they translate. But I think if a partner was to see these symptoms, I think the key is always communication. Is like let them know that you're aware that there may be an issue. Do not pressure them to be different, but lead by example. So if someone's particularly overeating, for example, it might just be a case of getting them involved with cooking a beautiful healthy meal, or just making sure that it's so complex. It's just so complex. It's like, where do you begin? Love. Show someone some love. You never know where the root cause of that eating disorder, and support and can go a long way to solve every issue. Every issue I think that's on the planet.
Yeah.
And you're trying to be kind. You're aiming for kindness, but you don't want to be manipulative in any way. But I also think, so we know, for instance, tentatively, that we think about 40% of reported binge eating disorder cases are male rather than female. So it's much more prevalent in men. well, partners and family members often begin to notice, because food they thought they were going to kind of eat and share together has vanished at some point that nobody noticed.
Yeah.
It's just gone, and it won't be a bit of it, it'll be all of it.
Yeah.
And those things, a lot of eating disorders, males and men and women, don't really like using the male and female thing as a noun. So men and women, boys and girls who end up with these issues, they're really good secret keepers, particularly of their own and often others' secrets. And so, trying to get secrets out of them, their own private stuff, can sometimes feel like wringing something out of the stone. But, being able to, it really is what Laurence was saying. If you're saying, oh, I was really looking forward to eating X with you when we sat down for dinner this weekend, can you find it? I can't see it. We got that together when we were out shopping, didn't we? Sometimes small things like that can be enough for a guy to say, oh, I've been doing that a lot lately. You've gone to bed and I just sit up and I eat anything I can put my hands on, or so I can't promise it'll work, but those small bits of communication, but done in a kind way, showing that it's because you were looking forward to sharing food with them or sharing time with them, is a lot better than kind of breaking a confession by getting them to admit that all of this stuff for the kid's birthday dinner has vanished somewhere between 12 and 2 a.m. So I would go with that, that kindness, and making it about shared experience together and why that might be changing, or why you might want to get that back. Those can sometimes work better to approach somebody.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
Change the environment as well. I think a lot of these disorders come from stress within a certain environment, and if you take someone away from that for a certain amount of time, away for a weekend in the countryside, that can really be a game changer in terms of like, the pressure's off. I don't need to compensate with food, or I don't need to be hard on myself. I can let go a little bit here. There is just me and you. I think just de-stressing in general is a fantastic way to say, I hear you, this something needed to change this week, because the taking away that stimulus can often be a trigger to realize that they were stressed in the first place, because stress is often like being drunk. It's like when you're in it, you feel you're completely unaware of it, and a lot of the time you're productive and busy, you're actually not, and you're just running around like a headless chicken without mental clarity, without mental focus from the confusion of all the cortisol released in the brain. So I think this is a really nice tactic, is just take someone into a nice stress-free environment, like we talked about, and go away to the countryside and see how someone responds.
You can catch up on the full session over on YouTube. Now let's hear from Danny, Alexis, Ash and Nathaniel for the panel Are You Man Enough? The Crisis of Masculinity.
Hi guys, I'm Danny Price and I'll be hosting today's Speak On, what's it called again? This is my first time doing this. I'll be hosting today's talk, and I hope you all enjoy. So if I'd just like to hand over to panellists to introduce themselves, that'd be great. So Ash, you go first.
Thanks. Cheers, Danny. Hi, everyone. My name's Ash Bhardwaj. I currently work mostly as a travel journalist. I write for the Telegraph Travel as a columnist, and I write freelance for a bunch of others and do a podcast called The First Mile, as well as doing freelance writing, bit of presenting and video production as well. I'm also an officer in the British Army Reserve. I'm in an infantry unit called 7 Rifles. So that takes up somewhere between 27 and 100 days a year, depending on what I'm doing. So those are the two things I spend most of my time doing. I've actually been in counselling and therapy for about 10 years. And so I am a great advocate of the value of discussing the underlying causes of male angst or general mental ill health, and finding good ways of dealing with it.
Great. And Alexis, you next.
Hi there, my name is Alexis Court. I always find it a bit awkward talking about myself, because we're taught don't show off, don't go and do all this stuff, but it's that cringe bit which you've got to do. So I have written some things. I also make a podcast focusing on the LGBTQ community, which is my home, that is my people. And I talk quite a lot about queer men's mental health as well, because as with all communities, the society that you are raised up in, your people, you will have specific needs according to that. I'm also an ambassador and a crisis counsellor for the Royal Foundation's mental health charity, which is called Shout. That is Shout 85258. We are a text crisis service similar to Samaritans, but we're all over text and digital. That was founded by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge about 18 months ago, and I've been on board since the start, and I'm currently approaching my master's in psychotherapy as well.
Great. And just in time, we have Nathaniel. Hi, Nathaniel. You need to, yeah. Can you, yeah?
That famous line of, you're on mute, you're on mute.
Yeah, it's one of those. Yeah, you're just in time. So if you want to just introduce yourself and just tell everyone about yourself, that'd be great. Thanks.
Certainly. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and apologies for my bit of delay. I had the wrong link mixed up. My name's Nathaniel Pamah. I'm from the UK, born in London, and I've worked in, I guess, I'm a brother of 6 siblings. I always like to start from family. Brother of 6 siblings, two sisters and 3 brothers, so altogether we're 6. I've worked in mental health for over 12 years now. Started when I was 21. Background in social science and mental health and recovery. I am a mental health and recovery facilitator and trainer, and I've just recently developing a wellbeing hub for those in the BAME community. So that's me in a nutshell, and thank you for having me.
Great stuff. So I guess we'll get straight into it. So our first question is, what does masculinity mean, and is masculinity in a crisis? And we're going to direct that to Ash first.
Thanks. Well, I guess masculinity varies across different groups for a whole host of things. You know, your ethnicity, your cultural background, your family background, your economic situation, kind of education you have. And masculinity seems to be perceived as ways of behaviours, values and attitudes that group decides this makes you masculine. And I guess that is becoming a lot more fluid now, because you would have said a few years ago that it's defined purely by an XY chromosome pairing, but I guess there's a lot more fluidity about the interpretation of that. So I think it's a good time to be thinking about what masculinity means. I guess the question about whether or not masculinity is in crisis might come down to the fact that a lot of things which used to be jobs done purely by people with that XY chromosome either don't exist, or they're becoming a lot more open. So I'm in the Army Reserve Infantry, and in the last couple of years, the infantry had dismounted close combat, as it's known, so the kind of stuff you see in Saving Private Ryan, has been opened up to women. So a lot of jobs that used to be purely for men are now open to everybody. And maybe the crisis comes from men losing their exclusivity in certain areas. And I think there are certain things that only women are able to do, or only people with a womb are able to do, such as give birth. There's not many things that men still do that women can't do. So perhaps a lot of the crisis of masculinity comes from that. There's nothing that makes us special anymore.
I see you nodding there, Nathaniel. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, it's a lot what I agree with there from Ash, and I think there's so many facets to what we regard as masculine. So I think what I come from also the dynamic of what we traditionally regard masculinity as. You know, it's been debated and argued that masculinity is a social construct. And so where do we get that idea from of what it means to be a man? And so that's where I think it segues into that. Is there a crisis because we're unsure about what masculinity is? And like what Ash emphasized, are women taking up the roles which are traditionally seen as what men roles are? But yeah, it's an interesting kind of totally covered debate here. So yeah, my nod in there.
Our next question is, it's for you, Alexis. It's, would you consider yourself to be man enough? It's a very broad question. I know. But like, yeah, what do you think?
I think that that's an absolute trap of a thing
Yeah.
to even ask ourselves, because it's like, well, enough for what? For me? For society? For culture? For my parents? For a partner? For what? That's the big thing. For me, absolutely. I like that personally. I quite enjoyably flit around the gender expression like spectrum, and that I quite happily play rugby and have done for years, and I really enjoy it. And that's a masculine space. I absolutely also love dancing and musicals, which is, quote, a less masculine space. And I don't have any problem with those two things coexisting within my own interpretation of masculinity. Does that mean that I'm not masculine enough for other people? Absolutely. I've been on the end of horrendous, like femphobia and gay shaming as well, because society has historically, for a very, very long time, told queer men, no, you're not man enough because of X, Y, and Z, because you're not a alpha, like, straight man's man. And so for me, it's, yeah, I'm man enough for me, but it's because I don't actually care. That's why.
Do you think that the actual term "man enough," the term, I actually can't stand it, to be honest. But do you think that that should be slowly, or as soon as possible, like sort of eradicated from language that we use?
Oh, just in the bin. Just absolutely bin it. What?
Yeah.
But like I said at first, man enough for what?
Yes.
And when you actually get that going and go, well, man enough for what? To do what? To be what? To be where? People can't answer it logically. You always have to get people to explain their own bias to out loud, and then they slowly unpick it for themselves.
Yeah. Ash, with your background, what do you think about that
Phrase?
Yeah.
I'll say, yeah, because I guess it comes down to internal and external validation. And if you look at people that are behaving what's often termed as toxic masculinity, which I guess really is just people lashing out in laddish, boorish, in misogynistic ways, you know, that often seems to be a reaction to them not having met some kind of external validation or external criteria of being masculine. You know, I've spent time in various different sort of masculine groups, whether that's playing rugby at university or afterwards, or indeed in the army, going through both Sandhurst and Brecon. And I've seen really good and really bad examples of what it means to be masculine enough. The worst examples are probably just, I guess, what would be quite what you would definitely call misogynistic behaviour towards women through some of my peers who I played rugby with at university. But then I look at other things that are really starting to shift that. And the military is a good example of this right now. Earlier on in the year, we were doing preparation for the stuff around COVID. And one of the first briefs we got was an excellent mental health brief, and the ability, talking about how you should speak to people about your feelings and accept that you will have a range of stress reactions. That just didn't exist in army discussions a few years ago. And I think it was triggered by the tragedies of what happened with people who came back from some of the recent conflicts and the way that affected their mental health. And just also, of course, if you think about the demographic that the army tends to recruit from, young men as a majority who have a higher proportion of suicide for young men. So the army's really started to recognise this problem and face up to it quite directly, which I think has been a really good thing that they've been doing. And how is that affecting the notion of masculinity within the army? Well, it suggests that now talking about your feelings and expressing them it has shifted from something that was not masculine to that's a part of masculinity. So it returns back to the fluidity element of what both Alexis and Nathaniel were talking about.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's very much the throughout, well, our lives anyway, like a lot of sort of, well, my uncles or father or whatever would be like, you know, it's the kind of mix up between masculinity and actual strength, you know, and I think that's always sort of been blurred and sort of delivered as strength is manly and is masculine, and it's not really the case, is it?
Well, what type of strength? Because there are
That's
many
very
different
true.
types of strength.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, like, obviously, like for guys being told, like, you know, strength, it's the physical strength, isn't it? Whereas, you know, I'm like not afraid to say it all. Like, in terms of mental strength, I think that women are a lot like better coping with that as opposed to men, because we're sort of told, you know, you need to be a man and you need to be strong, but you know, that's only showed in physical strength, but you know, they don't actually attach the mental strength to it. Do you know what I mean?
I can only speak for that one organisation that I'm a part of, and I like seeing how that has changed literally in the last 2 to 3 years. And I think you do need institutions in leadership positions to drive that kind of change, whether that's school, government, or in that case, the military, saying, look, this is what you're doing. I mean, the difference with the military, of course, is you say, this is what you're doing because it's your job. You have to sit around and talk about this, which is quite an enforced method, but then it eventually becomes a new form of behaviour.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to see that you can just change that over the course of a few years by instituting enforced behaviours.
I'm going to go back to Alexis. Like, in terms of the terminology, toxic masculinity, what do you feel about the term?
That we can get into very obvious discussions around it, and that toxic masculinity is people shouting, it is people violent, is people being sexually violent as well. But it's also us speaking to little boys and be like, you're a big boy, don't cry. That's toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is the fact that men are far more likely to die from cancer because they don't want to go to the doctor and cause a fuss. It is the fact that men only make up 1/3 of mental health recommendations to get help from the NHS, and yet 75% of suicides. That's all toxic masculinity. Like, toxic masculinity is the fact that if you look at celebrities, we have lots of, not enough, but we have a lot of out gay celebrities, and we have a huge galaxy full of out heterosexual celebrities who've never actually had to come out as heterosexual. But where are the bisexual men? Where are they?
Good point.
Because toxic masculinity actually really represses people's expression of themselves, because it's like, nope. You can't step foot into that fluid pool or into the other pool. So toxic masculinity is all of those things.
How can we open up the dialogue around mental health?
Well, from my experience, the process has been, so I've worked in mental health across a few teams, early intervention to CAMS, to drugs and alcohol, to community mental health teams. And I think always the approach of psychological therapies, the fact of being able to talk, as we're doing now, even this being a helpful exercise. But there are stages, so it depends on someone's situation in their own mental status, shall we say. So we use an approach called the cycle of change. And sometimes people are kind of in a situation where they're not even acknowledging that there's something that they need to address, be it in this case, you know, identity, masculinity. And so there's normally an approach of a one-to-one, you know, having that space to just speak to someone on a one-to-one. And then once you can be more expressive, or being able to actually acquire the tools to express how you feel, you know, even down to the describing words. And I've struggled with that personally, of being able to say, well, is happy and I'm sad the only things that I know? So I think there's being able to equip someone with the tools to educate them, to allow them to explore different ways they can express themselves, whether that's through art therapy. There may need to be an indication or a referral or an acknowledgement that medication may need to come into play. But it's normally, for me, the therapeutic approach, starting on a one-to-one and then opening up into a group. And always, I think family therapy is a good dynamic. The first, what we've all touched on, the first 0 to 5 years of your life is your developing years, your attachment years. And that's what's crucial as well. So yeah, I think there's stages to it. It doesn't work for everybody. And the last thing I would mention is that that approach of why we don't go into the health services as much. I think there's as much as how we feel, and society, the institution and how it's, systematically arranged is not kind of opening, I think, to all people, sexuality, religion, race still, but it's getting better. But it's that which I think also plays a part in stopping us, from really engaging.
That's great. That's a great answer. I'm going to take this over to Ash, and on that subject, is there any sort of experience that you've had, or any experience that you wish you had to sort of help you recognize at an earlier stage or a more relevant stage the issues surrounding mental health with your job or in school or anything like that?
With any kind of ill health, whether that is body ill health or mental ill health, you often are unaware of the first stages of an illness, and it's only when you get some quite clear symptoms that you start to notice anything going wrong. If you've got bad posture, then suddenly you're unable to use your shoulder one day. If you'd have known halfway along that you had a problem with your tendon, you could have stopped yourself destroying your shoulder. We're just not attuned to having that sensitivity about our emotions and our mental health. And I think, Nathaniel talked about the describing words, and I'd never thought about it like that before. But if we discuss those sort of things at earlier ages at school and primary school, then we'd be better able to express anxiety or depression or everything else that's on the spectrum in between happiness and depression. And for me, I didn't know what was going. I'd effectively had a panic attack, and I didn't identify it as a panic attack. I wasn't able to self-identify that, and I'd gone into A&E, and it was only because I was with my mum, and I was 26 at the time. She's the one that took me in, and one of the doctors or nurses asked, "Are you depressed?" It was my mum that answered on my behalf. I was just unaware of that. I was unaware that I was having an expression of mental health with a panic attack, and I was unaware of my background emotion being that low, my background mood being that low. So that's where discussion and being able to use examples, and for everyone being able to access examples of what those things are, is important. Now, some of that can be art and culture, that can be television series, and I think one of the great things about TV over the last 5 or 6 years is there's been much better expression of mental health and much better honesty about the things that people go through. Guilt is quite an important aspect of this. I think if you have mental ill health or you have a mental health crisis, then it's like, shit, there's something wrong with me, without understanding that often those things are a product of trauma. For me, it was having an alcoholic father. And then knowing that going through counselling and therapy can be a really powerful way of coping with those things. Even though you don't ever have a resolution, full resolution necessarily, understanding that these things can be made better. I think simply knowing that those things exist and that things are okay is half of the path. And I think arts and culture is a really powerful way to do that. And then specific education is another one. And I've mentioned how they do it in the army, but I think it's quite hard for people in other institutions or once you've left education to be able to gain that knowledge.
That's right. It's something that I feel quite strongly about. Similar to you, Ash, I suffered from mental health issues for basically all my life and didn't even realise it. It was only like a couple of years ago when I was finally able to sort of do something about it. And I've always thought that there should be some sort of exercise in like secondary school or maybe even primary school to sort of reach out to kids that may not know that they are sort of building up some kind of mental issues. What do you guys think about that? I'll go to Alexis first.
I completely agree. There should be. There used to be, and then the Conservatives cut it all away, quite simply enough. So if you want to sum up why we're having such a bad mental health crisis in schools and in young men, in one word, it's Tories. In a longer answer, it's because we've had I personally believe, back in the 70s, in the Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan years, where there was this whole belief of there is no such thing as society, and it's all about the individual, and individualism reigned. I personally believe we're still experiencing the after effects of that because we aren't funding things properly. We don't have that social support structure. In existential psychotherapy, which is the school of therapy that I believe in most and practice, one of the key fundamentals that it argues we need is society and social connectiveness. School is a really, really important place where we can get that. But unfortunately, it's being eroded because they're being turned into young people having to just perform for tests rather than thinking of people as holistic human beings. And realistically, you can't perform in a test if you're not performing like fully in your own brain, because mental health is coming in. Like, teenage years are difficult for nearly everybody. Your hormones are just playing horrendous tricks on you at that time of your age, let alone all the other things that society will throw at young people. And so we really, really do need support for young people. And as like Nathaniel and Asha rightly said, that begins with education as well, and just starting to talk to people from a young age and model that as well.
That's great. And Nathaniel, can I get your views on that, and maybe like any ideas of what we sort of can do and what advice you'd give to any sort of, you know, people in education or tutors or stuff like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I was going to touch on is kind of leading from what Alexis had mentioned. With regards to education, there's one facet which doesn't even need to be in the setting of a school. And it's ironic that, again, mention of the Tories, but our lovely Kemi Bernadotte, I believe her name is, mentioned quite rigorously in that kind of the debate they had with regard, or celebration of Black History Month. She mentioned, you know, we cannot afford to have critical theory within schools. They're critical theory. And it's that very essence of being able to be critical of oneself, of society, as an individual, is what can open up the mind and bring about more of, you know, in a safeguarding way, a healthier development of one's mental state, you know, because they're able to question things freely, or more freely, to be able to explore. So that's one aspect. But then going back into schools, and, you know, for children, for play clubs, after school clubs, summer clubs, Saturday schools, the idea of what we traditionally know as female roles and male roles need to be, and I like the word Alexis used, fluid. It needs to be where when I was at school, we had home economics. You know, that was essentially learning how to cook. We know traditionally in thinking that that's a female, you know, role, although it's changed, very much changing now. And so the changing of roles allowed young people to have to, almost in an institutional way, have to engage in things, to ask questions. And that's where I think that element of critical thinking can also come in. So I think those are two suggestions that I would give. And also to just discuss that healthy, I always think within the home, you know, it's very key. And I kind of take on board, similar to Alexis, I had my father and my stepfather. My father passed away. I had my own mental health challenges and, you know, was depressed for periods, and that fluctuates. But family, you know, and that doesn't need to be biological, but family and the ability to talk, I think, is what's helpful through those younger years and growing up into that. So yeah, that's the advice I would give.
What advice?
If I could just add a quick addendum, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Just to anyone who is in the audience wondering, kind of like, well, why are they raising politics around this? And it's because mental health is the self, and the self is political. We're talking about, well, you need to get support through the NHS. Well, the NHS is funded by political parties. It is political parties that decide what funding they get. We're saying, what can we do for children in schools? It's political parties which decide what goes into school funding, what goes into the curriculum. It's political parties that decide how much CAMS, child and adolescent mental health services, gets funded. So the self and mental health is inherently political. So you have to discuss both in tandem. It's difficult and it's uncomfortable because then you get into that whole we shouldn't talk about politics thing, but they are interlinked.
Of course. To all of you, really, we'll start with you, Nathaniel. What advice would you give for men that are struggling to open up but need to?
I'm going to take my own personal example, which I've kind of flirted about, and it's very simple, but I've needed to set an alarm clock. Writing in a journal, writing in a diary, just from what you can do right now with no cost by yourself individually, a starting point. I'd always say writing or even voice recording, to then read it back, to then listen over to what you've said, because you need to have the conversation with yourself first and try and figure out what are the problems or what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses of yourself, you know, an exploration of self. So I would always advocate a diary, and there in itself is also something that has been traditionally known as a female thing to do. But if you want to break that mold, you know, and help oneself, and as I said, I need to set an alarm clock because it's so not in my routine or about me. Well, diary, what do I need to do that for? But it's been very helpful, and I would advocate that to any person, anyone. You know.
I will take that same question to Ash.
Thanks. That's a really good point, Nathaniel. I keep mine here for exactly that reason. Similarly, I found meditation to be quite a useful thing, just because it gives you time to just sort of self-reflect and see what thoughts and emotions are coming up, and then that sort of puts you more in tune with your own, makes you more sensitive to your own feelings in a way that often you're distracted by the pace of life or Instagram or everything else, and it's a way to just have that time to focus on yourself. Another one is, we hear the phrase, it's good to talk a lot. And I think something that's important is to acknowledge that maybe the first person you speak to may not be the right one to speak to for you. And when I think about my friends, each of them have very different roles in my life, and each of them I speak to about for very different things. And actually, the ones that have turned out to be the ones that are best for me to speak to about my own anxieties, my own fears, tend to not have been the ones I would have expected to have been the best ones to speak to. And so if when you're speaking to people about things, the first person doesn't respond particularly well or in a way that reassures you, it's easy to then be put off. So I think what I'm trying to say is, if the first person you speak to doesn't turn out to be the right one, maybe just try and speak to some other people until you finally get a response that works, or an experience that works better for you.
From a very tangible and immediate point of view, and building on what Ash said about reaching out and speaking to people, as a ambassador and a crisis line counsellor for Shout 85258, that's Shout 85258, everybody, just straight up and down your keyboard on your phone. You can text Shout to that number, and there is immediate free confidential crisis intervention and counselling. We actually get a lot of men reaching out on the line, because a lot of men struggle quite often to have those first conversations and verbalize what they're feeling inside. Because as we discussed earlier, we're not equipped from a young age to actually really do that process of self-analysis and explain what is going on inside of us. So if talking or reaching out to a friend or a family member is too daunting, try texting, because actually sometimes it's easier to write it down, and they're absolutely right. Journaling is fantastic. Texting, again, is tapping into that same thing where it's letting your subconscious kind of take over a little bit. And that's the same reason why journaling is so good. That's a very practical tip. I would also, again, coming back to existential psychotherapy, there are a whole bunch of different things which existential psychotherapists and philosophers believe causes mental anguish. Two of the ones which I think affect men the most is isolation and meaninglessness. Isolation, particularly relevant during lockdown and COVID years. A lot of the ways that men actually support one another, football, the pub, the gym, suddenly taken away from us. Whereas women have a culture, speaking in very gendered stereotypes here, of being able to ring one another and have a conversation. Whereas actually men don't traditionally do that as much. And the places where men go to for support are taken away by lockdown. So find ways of combating that social isolation, reach out. And the other one, meaninglessness. We've had, as we've touched on again earlier, a wave where kind of like the meaning of life is rapidly changing in the 21st century. And a lot of people are arguing, well, if I'm not the breadwinner, if my wife or my girlfriend is earning more than me, am I the man of the house? If I'm actually not the one who is then making all these decisions, am I an alpha male? If I'm not doing this hyper masculine job of being a factory worker, of working in steelworks, of being in a mine, that either my father or my grandfather did when he was my age, am I a man? Am I not able to, if I'm not able to buy a house, am I a failure? This meaninglessness is quite corrosive and quite pervasive. So find a way to connect with the cause bigger than self. So Ash is volunteering with the army. It's a fantastic way and a really great example because it provides a purpose. It gets you out of yourself, connects you with something bigger than yourself, and also provides connection and fights isolation. So one of the reasons why I volunteer is because it connects me with other like-minded people. It gets me out of myself and it gets me involved in other people, and it puts some responsibility onto me, and it puts some routine into my life at times when I really need it, and provides me some structure. So consider if people are getting isolated, and consider if actually you're just feeling a bit disconnected from the world and with a loss of purpose. Find something that is important to you and find a way to connect with it at a community level.
That's great.
Thanks for listening to this special edition episode of the Speak On podcast, featuring content from our online event series, We Need to Talk About Mental Health. We're really looking forward to hosting more events online and hopefully offline. See you soon.